This week I'm going to talk about manifestos. It again was a week where we saw the convergence of events in what is best described as a very disruptive world. It was an interesting week for us before we came to California. We had an opportunity to go up to Michigan to meet our two new identical twin great nieces. They were born in early January, so they're getting close to 4 months old. I saw this graphic of the people with the hourglasses, the older person with the hourglass that has not that much sand left, and the younger person that's got all the sand left in their hourglass. And that's sort of how I felt after I saw these two darling little girls. So let's look at some things that occurred this week, just a little bit from biblical worldview, some things that are going on, I think, that indicate that Christians in the United States are entering a period where we're going to have increasing persecution, increasing unpopularity of our views. We've had a pretty good run until now. Then we'll talk a little bit about some things that have happened in the Middle East and elsewhere in geopolitics. This is an interesting from a biblical worldview standpoint. This is an article, front page of the San Francisco Chronicle the other day, and it says that the article is titled, Science Unveils Secrets of the World's Tallest Trees. Genetic Codes Show How They Could Survive a Volatile Future. It's interesting that in a city that is technology driven, where people spend their careers writing computer code for very complex technological systems, that they would put this article on about trees that have evolved to a certain standpoint, yet they call it coding. So I think it shows sort of the incoherent aspect of some of the secular worldview today, that they make their living on codes. They find codes in living things like trees, yet they say, well, these codes just happen by chance or random selection. And it's a very incoherent worldview. Now, earlier this week, I think on Wednesday or Thursday, Franklin Graham put out a tweet about Pete Buttigieg. Now, I mentioned Mayor Buttigieg. He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He's running as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, and he has gotten into a bit of a public tiff with Vice President Mike Pence over his lifestyle. He is a gay man. He's married to a man. And he has sort of taken the position that he's much more evolved in his Christian faith than Vice President Pence is. So Franklin Graham took the opportunity this week in a tweet to say that Mayor Pete Buttigieg is like everybody else. He needs to repent of his sin, and he's living in a sinful lifestyle. Now, the Charlotte Observer editorial board put out a pretty, I think, scathing editorial criticizing Franklin Graham for that tweet, titled The Gloriously Growing Irrelevance of Franklin Graham. So I just want to show you a little bit of what this says. And this is not an insignificant newspaper relative to Franklin Graham. Charlotte is where the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association has its headquarters. It's where Billy Graham, Franklin Graham's father, is buried. And so for them to come out and say this about a local person, I think shows where this has gone. So here's what they say. And the statistics here show that this is an issue that is rapidly changing within what we would call professing evangelicalism. Graham also, the editorial says, doesn't represent most Christians. An American Values Atlas survey released last month showed that Christians overwhelmingly support non-discrimination protections for the LGBT community. That support range from 71% of white mainline Protestants to 54%, with only 38% against, of white evangelicals. And it goes on to say that evangelicalism have changed, and Graham is becoming irrelevant. And the editorial says, in part, that's because Graham's perspective on homosexuality has been pushed to the fringe, but it's also because of how he has marginalized himself with his vocal support of Donald Trump. The editorial continues, and like Trump, Graham has abandoned any pretense of moderation. He's happy to appeal to his base because that's the only group that can sustain him now. That base, however, is becoming as shallow as the Reverend's message, as narrow as his worldview, as antiquated as a tweet that criticizes a gay man for flaunting it. Franklin Graham's words used to remind us of how far the LGBTQ community and its supporters have to go. Now he shows us how far we've come. And again, this is a common theme. This is the same theme that Barack Obama echoed in his speech right after the Obergefell same-sex marriage decision in June of 2015. If you recall, in that speech after the Obergefell decision, Obama essentially said, well, we have to get our friends and neighbors and family to evolve on this issue. In other words, to get to a higher level of understanding, implying that people that hold a traditional view of same-sex marriage are somehow unevolved. Hillary Clinton picked up on that in her campaign, where she said that certain views had to be changed. And so here we see that this view is becoming more widespread. This is the view of the Charlotte Observer editorial board. This is happening or having an impact on institutions. For example, Yale Law School now has a non-discrimination policy. The non-discrimination policy says that if you're at a campus organization, an organization that meets on campus, you have to have a non-discrimination policy, which means that if you're a Christian organization, you cannot say that people are no longer allowed to be in leadership if they're living together or they're involved in a same-sex relationship or anything like that. So in other words, what the Yale Law non-discrimination policy does is allow discrimination against Christian groups. And that's kind of the point. So this is an increasing trend. I think that we're going to see this increase in the United States, and I think there will be a period of time where Christians will be persecuted for their faith. I mentioned last week, it just happened just before I started speaking, this terror attack that occurred in Sri Lanka. It was on a number of Catholic churches and other institutions there, some hotels, suicide bombers. It's come out now that the suicide bombers appear to have had the support of the Islamic State. Some of those suicide bombers came from families where the father was a multimillionaire. There were 8 or 9 attacks. There were close to 400 people killed. It was very bloody. Now, I know there's a lot of, whenever a terror attack like this happens, besides the people who immediately claim that it's a false flag or that it didn't even occur, there's usually, for example, in this case, these were mainly Catholic churches, and evangelicals do not accept Catholic Church as part of Christianity. But the point of some of these terror attacks is not so much, look, what terrorists don't do when they do these terror attacks is the terrorists don't go and look at statements of faith. They see a Christian church, and they don't care whether it's a theologically correct Christian church or a theologically incorrect Christian church. The point that they're doing is they're attacking what they perceive as Christianity. Now, we can argue about whether these churches are true Christianity or not. I don't believe that Catholicism teaches the true gospel of Jesus Christ. But the point is that the people doing the terror attacks thinks that they're attacking Christians. And that's why it's important for Christians to be aware of what's going on and to understand that there are people that want to annihilate Christians, as these suicide bombers indicated. Now, some of the responses to this were interesting. Here's tweets from Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. I'm not playing any clips of them. I'm just showing you their tweets. And in both of those, they use the term, Barack Obama, the attacks on tourists and, quote, Easter worshipers. Hillary Clinton also said, everyone affected by today's horrific attacks on Easter worshipers. I would just say, Secretary Clinton, former President Obama, it's actually okay to use the word Christians because that's who the terrorists thought they were attacking, not Easter worshipers, but Christians. And that's the point. This was an attack on what people thought were Christians. Again, they didn't really care what their statement of faith was. Foreign policy followed these attacks up with an article titled "Sri Lanka Attack is the Wave of the Future." And the reason for this is that there were tens of thousands of people who immigrated to Syria and Iraq to join the Islamic State. A lot of them are now returning home, and these people are now engaged in terror attacks. And in fact, the Islamic State came out and took credit for the attack in Sri Lanka. We also had things come out with regard to the fire that occurred at Notre Dame in Paris. If you recall, President Macron of France had said that they would have a competition to rebuild Notre Dame so that all faiths could celebrate it. So what's happened now is that there are ideas being floated out there for the reconstruction of Notre Dame. For example, here's one that was published in the Times of London concerning a new spire, crystal spire, and a different roof and a viewing platform and that sort of thing. One view is, this came from an architect named Tom Wilkinson, published in Domus, said the question of rebuilding even more beautifully raises as many questions as it answers. And here's what he said in his article. And you see the picture here because the picture here shows a minaret where the spire used to be, the one that collapsed in the fire. And Wilkinson said this: to rebuild even more beautifully in this regard could mean, for instance, transforming Notre Dame into a memorial to the generations of peasants who were exploited to fund it and the heretics murdered by its client. Or, if the barbarism of which this building is a document has grown too cold to trouble us, why not a monument to a more up-to-date form of political truth? Again, you see the same theme continuing from the Mayor Buttigieg to Obama and Hillary Clinton, and now this architect. So a more up-to-date form of political truth. How about, in this instance, a monument to the yellow vest, complete with a day-glow spire? Or if that seems a little frivolous, what about the approximately 100 Algerians who were killed by the French police while protesting the Algerian War in 1961, many of them thrown into the Seine at the foot of Notre Dame? These victims of the state could be memorialized by replacing the spire with what? Why not? A graceful minaret. So this is where this is going. They're going to try to make political statements about the reconstruction of a cathedral that to a lot of people represents Christianity. Now, we're not going to get into whether it represents true Christianity or not. Again, the point is that it's what people think it represents. And the people that, if this was a terror attack, and there's things coming out that just don't make a lot of sense about whether this was or was not a terror attack. Over at the Gatestone Institute, there is an article titled "The Annihilation of Christian Life and People, Where is the Outrage in the West? Meeting Catastrophe with Indifference." It's by Giulio Miati, excellent writer for the Gatestone Institute. And he makes a few points here. In his article, Mr. Miati, in the Gatestone Institute article, says this: "Where is the outrage in the West for the annihilation of Christian life and people? It feels as if there is no indignation, only silence interrupted by bombs and Allahu Akbar. The history books of the future will not condone this Western betrayal. If the West had taken seriously the persecution of Christians, now the bell would not toll for the death of the Christian presence, not only in historic lands of Christianity, but also for the West. Islamic extremists have seen that that the West is not mobilized to prevent them from repressing Christians, as if unconsciously there were a strange convergence between our silence and the ethnic cleansing project of the Islamic State, erasing Christians." In his article, "The Annihilation of Christian Life and People, Where is the Outrage in the West?" By Giulio Miati, an excellent writer. I highly recommend his work. He makes a couple of points. One of the points that he makes is this, following the attack in Sri Lanka. "Where's the outrage in the West for the annihilation of Christian life and people? It feels as if there is no indignation, only silence, interrupted by bombs and Allahu Akbar. The history books of the future will not condone this Western betrayal. If the West had taken seriously the persecution of Christians, now the bell would not toll for the death of the Christian presence, not only in historic lands of Christianity, but also for the West. Islamic extremists have seen that the West has not mobilized to prevent them from repressing Christians, as if unconsciously there were a strange convergence between our silence and the ethnic cleansing project of the Islamic State aimed at erasing Christians. The British author Melanie Phillips has called this persecution of Christians our guilty secret. Another thing that I think from a geopolitical perspective that you should continue to pay attention to is China's promotion and funding of the Belt and Road Initiative. This involves the Middle East, Israel, and that area as the land bridge between the East, China, and Asia, and the West and Europe. I think it's very important to pay attention to this. I do think it plays into Bible prophecy. You see this article in the Jerusalem Post just the other day. Syria wants to play a role in China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's why what's going on in Syria right now, and the players that are involved there, Russia, Turkey, Iran, that this is an important component of Bible prophecy, and the Belt and Road Initiative plays into that. Another thing that continues to come up in the Middle East is the speculation about the Trump plan, the Trump peace plan. The PLO has said that we're not going to participate in this, we're not going to accept it. The Palestinians, some people have said, unidentified people have said that Arab states are pressing the Palestinians to accept whatever it is that Trump puts out. That's now going to be in June. Jared Kushner was interviewed this week about some aspects of the Trump plan at an event where Time magazine honored the 100 most influential people in the world. Now, Kushner was not on the top 100 list, but because this peace plan has sort of captured everybody's imagination as to what it might be, he was interviewed at this event by Time magazine, and here's what he had to say.
Can you give us some more definitive time frame on when the Middle East peace plan will be released?
Yeah, so we're going to wait till after Ramadan now. We were getting ready at the end of last year, and then obviously they called for Israeli elections. Prime Minister Netanyahu had a great victory, and he's in the middle of forming his coalition. Once that's done, we'll probably be in the middle of Ramadan, so we'll wait till after Ramadan, and then we'll put our plan out. And what I'll say about that is, when my father-in-law asked me to work on this project, the Middle East peace process, I mean, it's about as tough of a problem set as you can get. And so we've taken, I think, an unconventional approach. We've studied, all the different past efforts and how they failed and why they failed. And there's been some tremendous work done by the people who have worked on this before us. So we've tried to do it a little bit differently. Normally they start with a process and then hope that the process leads to a resolution for something they have been able to resolve for a long time. What we've done is the opposite. We've done very extensive research and a lot of talking to a lot of the people. We're not trying to impose our will. I think the document you'll see, which is a very detailed proposal, is something we created by engaging with a lot of people from the region and people who have worked on this in the past. And I hope that it's a very comprehensive vision for what can be if people are willing to make some hard decisions. And so we started with a proposed solution, and then we'll work on a process to try to get there.
Does it include a two-state solution?
Yeah, so we have not said today. We're going to lay that out very clearly. I think that...
Can you get Arab country support for your plan?
I think that if people focus on the old traditional talking points, we will never make progress, right? I mean, you have the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, which was, I think, a very good attempt. But if that would have worked, we would have made peace a long time ago on that basis. So what we're going to put out is different. Our focus is really on the bottom up, which is how do you make the lives of the Palestinian people better? What can you resolve to allow these areas to become more investable, We deal with all the core status issues because you have to do it, but we've also built a robust business plan for the whole region. I think that the two together have the opportunity to push forward. And then from Israel's point of view, their biggest concern is just security. And I think that what we do is something that allows for Israel to maintain security, but there'll be tough compromises for both. I had a business mentor who would say to me that when he'd have to take tough decisions, he'd make a T-chart, reasons to do something, reasons not to do something. And I hope that when they look at our proposal, I'm not saying they're going to look at it and say, this is perfect and, let's go forward. I'm hopeful what they'll do is to say, look, there are some compromises here, but at the end of the day, this is really a framework that can allow us to make our lives materially better. And we'll see if the leadership on both sides has the courage to take the leap to try to go forward.
Well, that's what Kushner had to say. An interesting article last week in the New York Times on the editorial section, opinion section. It was, I don't think it made it into the newspaper that's actually published, but it's on their website. And it talked about, it was written by a man, and the caption or the title of the article is, as a black child in Los Angeles, I couldn't understand why Jesus had blue eyes. Now, this goes through supposedly the New York Times fact-checking, and this is what it said, quote, as I grew older, I learned that the fair-skinned, blue-eyed depiction of Jesus has for centuries adorned stained glass windows and altars in churches throughout the United States and Europe. But Jesus, born in Bethlehem, was most likely a Palestinian man with dark skin. Now, this is just an absurd statement, and it shows how the New York Times really doesn't engage in very good fact-checking. There was no such thing as Palestinian people at the time of Jesus Christ. Jesus was Jewish. He was born in Bethlehem of Judea. It was governed at the time by Rome, and there was no such thing as Palestine. Palestine had never existed at the time of the birth of Jesus Christ. But it just goes to show you how this issue, this Palestinian issue, becomes burdened with a lot of unhistorical claims. The fact that it does, I think, shows or plays into what I see a rising anti-Semitism. Now, one of the most significant things I've seen in terms of anti-Semitism was published in the international edition of the New York Times on April 25th. There was, on the editorial page, where they had continued a front page editorial in the international edition, Sad Waste of a Crisis on Immigration, written by Tom Friedman, who is Jewish. And it continued over on the editorial page on page 16, and you see up there, you see this editorial cartoon of a blind Donald Trump being led by a dog with the head of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Star of David on his collar. Now, this plays into all of the anti-Semitic tropes that we see, that the Jews control the world and that the Jews are just leading the United States around, the Jewish leader leading the United States around on foreign policy. And this was published in the New York Times. Now, the New York Times was called on it. They have issued this statement. A political cartoon in the international print edition of the New York Times on Thursday included anti-Semitic tropes depicting the Prime Minister of Israel as a guide dog with a Star of David collar leading the President of the United States, shown wearing a skull cap. The image was offensive, and it was an error of judgment to publish it. It was provided by the New York Times News Service and Syndicate, which has since deleted it. Now, if something like this had been done with regard to an Islamic person or a progressive or a leftist of some kind, the New York Times would have done a number of things. They would have fired the people that were involved, and they would have issued an apology. What they issued here in this statement that was on their Twitter page is not anywhere near an apology. The cartoonist, at least is what I've been able to determine in my research over the last couple days, the cartoonist that published this or that made up this cartoon has a history of making these anti-Semitic cartoons. You see here one is the boot of Uncle Sam, and you see that the spur is the Star of David. This is very common. If you want to follow, I think, the best analysis of this, there's a front page article in the Jerusalem Post on today's Sunday, April 28th, written by Seth Frantzman. New York Times prints anti-Semitic caricature of Trump, Netanyahu in Papers International Edition. Now, Seth is one of the editors at the Jerusalem Post. I believe he's the articles editor. And he's done just a great job in analyzing this. If you want to follow him on Twitter, S. Frantzman is his Twitter handle. And he also has a website, sethfrantzman.com, where he's laid out the reactions to this. It's interesting that none of the Jewish writers of the New York Times have said, I checked their Twitter accounts, nobody has said a word. Bret Stephens has not said a word. Thomas Friedman has not said a word. Michelle Goldberg has not said a word. Now, Michelle Goldberg comes out with, I believe, anti-Semitic editorial opinion pieces every so often. Bret Stephens does not. But these people work for an organization that engaged, I believe, in one of the most anti-Semitic things that I have seen in some time. And this is a common theme that I think you're going to see increasingly, that these Jews, certain Jews, rule the world. Now, I don't agree with this. I think it is anti-Semitic, and at least from my perspective, I'm going to stand against it. Now, a lot of people have written to me about these theories that have developed about a thing called the Noahide laws. And I've been researching it. I haven't said anything about it, but I am concerned with the direction that some of the claims that you see in YouTube videos and elsewhere, that these Noahide laws are going to be what is eventually leads to the beheading of Christians. The Noahide laws, they say, are being pushed by Jewish rabbis who are, they call them the modern day Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, that sort of thing. And they're being pushed by them. And that they're now enacted into law in the United States. Now, without going into a long discussion about this, here is my concern. One, the Noahide laws have not, I repeat, they have not been enacted as the law of the United States. There was a resolution during the Bush administration that was adopted by Congress. The purpose of the resolution was to recognize and honor Menachem Schneerson, who was the head of the Lubavitcher sect of Judaism. He passed away, I believe, in 1990. Maybe 1994. He was in his 90s when he passed away. He didn't have any children. There was a lot of belief by some of the people in the Lubavitcher sect that he might be the Messiah and that he would rise from the dead even. You may remember that there was a short video during near the end of the campaign in the 2016 election in which Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump went and prayed at either the shawl that honors Schneerson or at his tomb. He's buried in Queens or Brooklyn in New York. And so a lot of people have played this up that Kushner is controlling Trump, and this plays into some of these anti-Semitic tropes. I don't think anybody really controls Donald Trump. I think that should be apparent by now. But you will see that there are these pictures now that you see published in different places in these YouTube videos about the Noahide laws, in which you will see Trump or another president surrounded by a bunch of Lubavitcher rabbis. And I think the implication is to be something like this editorial cartoon. Whether these Noahide laws are ever enacted into law in the United States is an open question. I have not seen anything to propose them other than some resolutions and some presidential proclamations. And I think most of the presidents since Bush 41 have issued such a proclamation, including, I believe, Donald Trump. But my concern is that the Lubavitcher sect is a minority sect within Judaism. I don't think that they have the political ability to get these enacted. And look, if I'm wrong if these things become enacted. But I'm concerned at the direction that this is going, that it plays into anti-Semitic beliefs, much like this editorial cartoon of Donald Trump. Now, I intend to talk more about it in the future after I've done some more research. But the main premise that I've seen advocated in some of these YouTube videos is that these have become part of the law of the United States. They have not become part of the law of the United States. If you violate one of these Noahide laws, you can't be charged with a crime. You can't be punished for anything. It's not a law yet. So I would just urge everybody to be very cautious in proceeding in this area because of what I believe it can result in, which is a growth of anti-Semitism. Now, look, I believe that the growth of anti-Semitism in the world that we're seeing everywhere is prophetic. And I think it's but I don't think we should participate in the growth of that. And that's a concern that I have. And as I said, if I'm wrong, I'll admit that I'm wrong. But I have not seen these things enacted into law in the United States, and that's the main premise. Another thing that sort of comes on the heels of all of this is an article that appeared recently in the Times of London by Janice Turner. And it was talking about how everybody is just at each other's throat about everything now in the world today. But it has a statement in here, and I guess what I'm trying to show you is that it seems that when it comes to the Jewish people in the state of Israel, they are treated much differently than anyone else. Facts don't really matter. Now, this is the Times of London. This is one of the most respected newspapers in the world. And look at what she says in this editorial piece. In Israel this month, I watched ultra-Orthodox Jewish settlers enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, to pray. Forbidden by law, yet protected by Israeli soldiers and the Netanyahu government, they were there to stake a land claim and foment hatred, with no care for the peaceful coexistence of the Oslo Accords, which died with Yitzhak Rabin. Now, there are so many statements, almost everything in this paragraph is completely untrue. She calls these people Jewish settlers, ultra-Orthodox Jewish settlers, because this is the common claim of the Palestinians. It's that these people are going to take over our holy sites. Now, first of all, Jewish settlers, let's just assume she's correct that these were Jewish settlers. Jewish settlers cannot enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. In fact, non-Muslims cannot enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. It's not possible. So for her to say that these Jewish settlers went up on the Temple Mount and went into the Al-Aqsa Mosque and prayed is a complete, unmitigated falsehood. It is not true. I was in Israel in 2017. I was there in 2011. At that time, you Christians, non-Muslims, were not allowed to go into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This shows a stunning ignorance of her, not even bothering to check out the structure of the Temple Mount, what buildings are there, and who's allowed to go where. When we were there in 1995, we were allowed to go into not only the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but the Dome of the Rock. But now, non-Muslims are not able to enter those places. As a general rule, I suppose there may be exceptions. I'm not aware of any. But for Janice Turner to say that Jewish settlers entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque recently is just factually incorrect. And it's so factually incorrect, it also leads to violence against Jews in Israel. Now, the other thing that she says is that they were there to stake a land claim and foment hatred. And you see the Muslims who follow them around screaming in their faces and their ears when a Jew or a group of Jews go up on the Temple Mount. That never gets mentioned. The last part of her statement there, that they go up there with no care for the peaceful coexistence of the Oslo Accords, which died with Yitzhak Rabin, that is historically untrue. The Oslo Accords were enacted in September of 1993. Between 1993 and 1999, I've posted a chart that I grabbed off a website that analyzed the terror attacks and other attacks that occurred after the Oslo Accords. There were hundreds of attacks. There was not peaceful coexistence. I believe that above 200 Israeli citizens died during that period of violence following the Oslo Accords. There was not ever peaceful coexistence. At least my knowledge is that over the last number of years, the number of Jews that have entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is zero. It is just simply not true. Now, this is from I believe, a Turkish newspaper or Turkish news service that says hundreds of settlers enter Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa for Passover. What it says below, and then maybe this is where she got this from, but it's just not true. Jews are not allowed to enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You see a picture here in the center. You see Yehuda Glick, who used to be a member of the Knesset. It says here, Jewish settlers perform religious rituals near Qibla, Dome of the Rock Mosque, Palestinian official says. But you see what the sub-headline says: perform religious rituals, they sacrifice some lambs, near the Dome of the Rock. Not in the Dome of the Rock, not in Al-Aqsa. So this person, and what they did was there was a traditional Passover blessing at the Western Wall this week, but it was at the Western Wall. It was not on the Temple Mount. So this is just demonstrably untrue. So what we see is this growing anti-Semitism. I see it coming in many communities. I see it comes from a mainstream, the newspaper of record, the New York Times. I see Christian websites promoting things that I think lead to anti-Semitism that I'm very concerned about. These things have a real-world impact. 90 miles away from where I am in Poway, down in the San Diego area yesterday, a gunman attacked a synagogue that was a Lubavitcher Shabbat. It was from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. This is the result of this anti-Semitism. This is the second attack in the United States in the last 6 months. So I think we need to be very careful when we talk about things in this particular area. And I think we need to think through the implications of what we're talking about and how that might cause anti-Semitic beliefs to increase. Is something that I'm very concerned about, and I think it's something we need to be very careful about. At oilprice.com, there is an excellent article. It's very long, and I will just I will read for you some sections of that. I would highly recommend that you go and look that up. I have the URL is located right here at the top of the article, oilprice.com. It's an excellent article by Yosef Badansky, dated April 24th. A new Middle East mega war is unfolding right before our eyes. Now, we know that there is an alliance of Persia or Iran, Turkey, some other countries, and another country that a lot of us believe is Russia. There have been a lot of meetings taking place particularly though that involved Turkey and Iran, and the competition between the two of them for the control of what's going to happen in Syria. So listen to some of these. The article says this: Iran is leading a new bloc with Turkey and Qatar intent on remaking the greater Middle East. The Iranian leadership recognizes that this drive might lead to a regional war and is actively preparing for such an eventuality. Iran's timing is logical. The main fratricidal wars in the region, mainly in Syria and Iraq, are slowing down because of the exhaustion of the main warring factions. The modern Arab states of the past decades are effectively gone. Neither continued recognition by global powers and international entities nor the chimera of elections will alter these dynamics. Hence, the overall dynamic affects all the countries of the region and all the great powers with interests there. Russia, the People's Republic of China, and Israel are taking active measures from political to military to contain and reverse the Iranian ascent. In all of this, the U.S. is proving irrelevant, despite its strident anti-Iran policies. A new bottom-up, decentralized reality is emerging on its own, and the main powers involved in the region are determined to exploit the dynamic in order to better control the post-crisis greater Middle East. So there's a lot of people competing here in the Middle East. And so this will have an impact, and I think this plays into Bible prophecy. So here's what it says, and I think this is the key part of the article. At the core of the anticipated escalation and possible war is the race between Iran and Turkey for preeminence in the area of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, as well as the dismemberment and collapse of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. It is logical to assume that a clash with Israel would inevitably ensue, for Israel is expected to strenuously resist the collapse of the regional order, which would be to its detriment. There is a rush to implement the resolutions of the March 18th summit, 2019 summit in Damascus of the military leaders of Iran, Iraq, and Syria to better coordinate region-wide military undertakings. And it goes and it relates the meetings that took place, and I mentioned some of these in previous updates. Assad went to Tehran. The leaders of Iran went to Baghdad to meet with the leaders of Iraq. So these meetings that took place over the last month have led to this gentleman writing this article. Here's what he continues. Syria was not integrated into the joint air defense with Iran and Iraq because the Russians, who are present everywhere in the Syrian air defense system, would not permit it. Hence, Damascus and Tehran started secret negotiations about replacing Russian advisors and experts with Iranians from the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran agreed to meet all the Syrian requests and volunteered to deploy Iranian air defense missile batteries and radars to Syria. Damascus, however, was in no position at this stage to expel the Russians from the Syrian armed forces. Also during the visit, I believe this is the Iraqi leader, or one of the Iraqi military person, agreed to the acceleration of the Iran-controlled strategic transportation projects on the territory of Iraq. The first phase was to complete, quote, the new highway from Tehran to the Mediterranean, which would link Tehran, Baghdad, and Damascus. The highway would be the first component of a comprehensive network of the new highways and rail systems that would link Syria with Iran via Iraq. So this is something I think you need to pay very close attention to. The other thing that I think is important to take away from this article is the competition between Turkey and Iran. That, I believe, plays directly into Bible prophecy. I think there may be some conflict between Turkey and Iran before an Ezekiel 38-39 invasion. That's based on a reading of, I forget the passage now, Daniel chapter 8. I think that is something that is yet future. It says it's for the time of the end. The other thing that was published recently, this is on was published by Khomeini a few weeks ago. It was dated, I think in late January, early February, the second phase of the Islamic Revolution, where he lays out what he thinks they're going to do. And here's you can find it at purestreammedia.com, the manifesto of Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran. And it talks about what they hope to accomplish over the next number of years. Now, this is interesting in that the timing of this comes in. There was a meeting that took place about 28 years ago in which this was discussed. And Gatestone Institute has a very good article on it called From Khartoum to Tehran, Graveyard of the Forlorn Hopes. And Amir Tahiri writes at the Gatestone Institute, it was just published early this morning, about what happened in Khartoum in Sudan 28 years ago. That there were a number of leaders, they were going to talk about how we're going to continue the Islamic Revolution that had continued. And their goal was that by 2021 they would have everything in place. Now, obviously they have not. But it's interesting that of the people that were involved in that meeting in Khartoum 28 years ago, only 2 of them still have not met their demise. And a lot of these people met a demise that was not, shall we say, very good. You can read the history of all of that. You can read the history of all of that in Amir Tahiri's article in the Gatestone Institute from early today on April 28th. It says this: it may be a coincidence that the Khomeini's manifesto was published almost exactly 28 years after the Khartoum gathering that attracted over 500 leading Islamist theoreticians and activists from all over the world. The men who gathered at PAIC, that was the conference in Khartoum, had fixed a 30-year period for their dream of recasting the world according to their vision of Islam to be realized. That rather optimistic vision was meant to sweep away the deep pessimism that marked their view of Islamic history as nothing but centuries of retreat and decline. To be sure, we still have 2 years before the 30-year deadline, and thus cannot be sure that the kind of Islam that Turabi dreamed of won't dominate the world in 2021. But what is certain is that, with a handful of exceptions, almost all the men who were supposed to build Turabi's brave new world ended rather badly. The one prominent exception to that is President Erdogan of Turkey. So I would highly recommend that you read this article in the Gatestone Institute, that you go to Pure Stream Media and you look through and it's a very dry, boring read, the second phase of the Islamic Revolution. And then I would also recommend that you go to oilprice.com and read this article about the new Middle East mega war is unfolding right before our eyes. I think these are 3 of the more important things that I've seen in the past several months. So that's going to be it for this week's prophecy update. Pay attention, watch what's going on, and I will follow up more of this in my next update, and I may cover some of this in my talk on Wednesday night at Devore. Thank you.